My name is Mara Ellington. And the moment that broke me wasn't when my father raised his voice. It was when he looked straight at my mother in court, called her nothing, and told her she'd leave their marriage with less than the price of a used car. He said it calmly, almost bored, like he'd rehearsed it, like 30 years of her sacrifice meant absolutely nothing. And when my mother's hand shook as she reached for the pen to sign her life away, my father glanced at me, smirked and whispered, "Don't interfere. You've never been able to stop me." That was the exact second something inside me snapped so loudly, I swear the whole courtroom should have heard it. I didn't know it yet, but that was the day I stopped being afraid of him, and the day he should have started being afraid of me. The courtroom felt colder than it should have, the kind of sterile chill that made every breath sharp. I sat behind my mother, close enough to see the subtle tremor in her shoulders each time she exhaled. The scent of old oak clung to the air, and the draft from the vents pricked at my skin. A few strangers waited for their own hearings, watching with quiet, distant curiosity. Thin bands of sunlight slipped through the tall windows, fading before they reached the floor. At the front, my father stood with the confidence of a man used to being obeyed. His voice carried that familiar, polished edge as he explained to the judge that the vineyard's success was entirely his doing, that the woman sitting behind him had contributed nothing of value. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at me. He wore the gray suit he reserved for moments when he wanted to broadcast victory. My mother accepted the pen the attorney offered, her hand trembling just enough to make my throat tighten. She didn't meet my eyes, too afraid I'd see the humiliation she was trying to hide. The attorney pushed a lopsided settlement toward her, nodding at my father as if they'd already sealed the outcome. My chest tightened, breath uneven, guilt rising like heat under my skin. When my father leaned forward to sign, something in me constricted. A sheet slid from the stack and fell at my feet. I reached for it, meaning only to return it until a line caught my eye. A reserve fund assigned to a name I didn't recognize. I didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But it was enough to tell me something was very wrong. I drove out of Sonoma with the courthouse still pressing against my ribs, the weight of it following me long after the building disappeared in the rearview mirror. Napa Valley stretched out ahead in familiar lines, the rows of vines running for miles, like threads of an old memory I never quite managed to shake. The late afternoon light slid across them, warm and deceptive, as if this place had ever been peaceful for us. Each curve of the road pulled me deeper into thoughts I'd spent years trying not to revisit. I couldn't stop seeing those parties my father loved hosting, the ones where he shined brightest. He'd stand in the middle of everyone, swirling a glass of wine like he was conducting a symphony, his voice loud enough to carry over the music and laughter. People praised him endlessly, calling him a genius, a visionary, the man who turned soil into gold. And behind the grill or in the kitchen doorway, my mother moved quietly, placing trays of food, wiping spills, disappearing into the scenery. No one ever asked how many hours she worked to make those events flawless. No one noticed her except to hand her another plate. There were moments he'd lean toward me with that tone of certainty he always used when he wanted me to understand something his way. He'd talk about how everything good in our lives came from him, and how people like my mother should be grateful to be near men who knew how to build. I remember nodding, even though something inside me recoiled. Back then I didn't understand why. Now it clicked into place with painful clarity. A memory surfaced, sharper than I expected. I was 16, passing by his office when I heard the quick rustle of papers. He shoved a stack into a drawer, slamming it shut right as my mother walked up behind me. She asked what he was hiding, and he blocked the doorway with that calm, controlled expression he used whenever he wanted to shut someone down. No yelling, just quiet dismissal. As a teenager, I thought it was about pride. Today, I knew it was something else, something he never wanted her to see. By the time I reached my mother's house, the sun had dipped low, turning the sky a deep gold. She opened the door before I reached the steps, smiling like she was relieved and frightened at the same time. Her eyes told the truth long before her voice did. I asked gently if I could look through the divorce paperwork. She hesitated more than she ever had with me, then handed it over with the kind of careful movements that come from years of being cautious. I spread the documents across her kitchen table. At first, everything looked predictable: itemized lists, estimates, valuations, but a supplemental sheet caught my eye: a trust, formed during the marriage, listing only my father and a second beneficiary I didn't recognize. My mother's name was nowhere. The realization settled heavy and cold. This wasn't just a divorce strategy. It was groundwork for something far more deliberate. I drove across town to see the one person who might tell me the truth without dressing it up. Darlene Fisher had stayed at the vineyard longer than most vines had roots. 14 years. Gone in a single, unexplained resignation. When she opened the door, she looked older than the last time I'd seen her. Worn in a way that didn't come from aging alone. Her eyes darted behind me, searching the quiet street as if expecting someone to follow. She didn't say much at first, just ushered me inside with quick, nervous gestures. The small living room smelled faintly of lavender and something metallic, like caution lingering in the air. She stood in front of me for a moment, clutching a manila envelope with both hands as if it were something alive. Then she pressed it into mine. "Your father is involved in things you don't want to believe." That was all she said. Her voice shook. And before I could ask anything, she insisted I leave. The urgency in her tone made the decision for me. I opened the envelope in my car. Inside was a complete copy of the trust I'd stumbled upon at my mother's house, but this version wasn't superficial. It was detailed names, distributions, dates, and under my father's name was the second beneficiary, Harlan Trent. The name meant nothing to me, yet everything in my gut tightened. I accessed the federal database I used at work, my fingers moving faster than my thoughts. Less than a minute later, a report filled the screen: real estate money laundering, inflated property valuations, 2 federal investigations, Nevada and Arizona both still open. I sat perfectly still, the engine humming beneath me. The trust wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a clerical mistake. It was a link between my father and a man tied to multi-state financial crimes. He wasn't just hiding assets. He was tied to someone who built entire fortunes on fraud. The envelope felt heavier than it should have when I set it beside me. Every instinct I had warned me I'd just crossed a threshold I couldn't walk back from. This wasn't simply about protecting my mother anymore. This was a trail. And it was leading straight into something far darker. By the time I reached Ellington Estate again, the sky had already turned the color of cooled ash. The house sat in its usual stillness. But without my father's presence, that silence felt less like order and more like a warning. I slipped inside and headed straight for the cellar, following instincts sharpened by years of watching him guard certain doors more fiercely than others. The cold hit me first, then the smell oak, dust, and something older, like the remnants of a life he'd curated carefully. Rows of barrels filled the space, each casting long shadows in the weak yellow glow overhead. I stepped between them the way I used to as a kid, only this time I wasn't looking to hide. I was looking for what he'd hidden. My eyes locked onto a safe tucked into the far left wall, darker than the surrounding stone, definitely newer. I knew every inch of this cellar. That safe hadn't been here before. A quiet rush of adrenaline steadied me. He had patterns, and I knew them. His birthday for things he barely cared about, but for anything tied to power or money. He used the founding date of Ellington Vineyard looted. I keyed it in. A soft click echoed like a break in the world I thought I understood. Inside was a stack of documents. The first pages detailed a transfer of 17% of the vineyard's acreage to a Nevada real estate company. My mother's signature sat at the bottom of the form. Straight and stiff, nothing like the soft, left-leaning swoop I'd watched her write all my life. Whoever signed this wanted it to look unremarkable. They failed. I pulled up the company's filing number in the secure federal database. A report appeared immediately, linking the business to a land laundering investigation from 2019. My breath chilled. Then I noticed a page shoved out of order in the stack. A sloppy mistake my father would never make. That misalignment told me more than any line item could. He hadn't just been hiding something. He'd been rushing. When I left the cellar, the wind cut through the vineyard rows with a sharp hiss, as if the vines themselves were trying to warn me. He wasn't simply a domineering man with a talent for control. He was crossing into criminal territory, dragging my mother toward a place she had no idea she was being led. And I was the only one who'd seen it. I drove back to Sacramento with the documents burning a hole in my bag, walked straight into my building long after everyone had gone home, and logged into the secure financial monitoring system. The glare from the fluorescent lights made the silence feel sharper, more absolute, perfect for what I needed to do. I entered the Nevada company's ID. Data flooded the screen instantly. 32 property transactions over 3 years, each swinging in value in ways that defied the market. It was textbook flip and inflate laundering, the kind buried inside shell corporations hoping no one looked twice. I cross-referenced the incoming and outgoing funds, and the air left my lungs. 3 years of withdrawals from my parents' joint account lit up in red. 1.9 million, then 2.3 million, then another 2 million. $6.2 million funneled straight through Wine Preservation Storage LLC, a company that pretended to store wine but actually stored the identities of people who wanted to vanish. Then I found the trust. Gray Falcon. No owner, no beneficiary, no address, a ghost account. These only existed for one purpose: to slip out of sight and keep running. I dug deeper, pulling up internal emails tied to the Nevada network. One message stood out like a flashing beacon. Tell Mr. E the Oregon properties are ready. After the divorce is finalized, he can proceed north. North wasn't metaphorical. It was a destination. He wasn't planning to divide assets. He was planning to disappear, and he was preparing to leave my mother trapped inside a financial web she had no hand in building. I printed everything, page after page sliding from the machine, each one a brick in the wall I needed to build before he could escape. When I finally checked the clock, it was past 3 in the morning. There was no turning back. Not for him, and definitely not for me. I got back to my apartment in Sacramento, just as the sky was starting to pale. I had barely slipped off my shoes when my phone vibrated with an email so sharp it cut through whatever exhaustion I had left. My father's attorney, Mark Halford, accused me of trespassing in the cellar, stealing private documents, and interfering with the divorce. Attached was a drafted restraining order meant to block me from the vineyard and, more painfully, from being anywhere near my mother when she signed the settlement. The message felt like a trap closing around my ankles. Nsteet. I called my mother, hoping for clarity, but her voice trembled the moment she picked up. My father had gone to her house before sunrise, insisting I was committing crimes, insisting he'd contacted the police, and he had. But as soon as she read me the date he listed, I felt a jolt run through me. I'd been working in Sacramento that entire day, logged in and out with government timestamps he couldn't manipulate. When I drove to see her, she stood at the counter gripping a dish towel with both hands, begging me to stop before I destroyed my future. The fear wasn't of what he might do to her, it was of what he might do to me. He knew that was the one pressure point I always reacted to. As I stepped outside, a familiar voice called my name. Caleb, one of the longtime workers from the estate, handed me a USB drive, glancing nervously toward the street. He said he couldn't stay involved, but thought I needed to see what was on it. In my car. I opened the footage. My father appeared on the screen, placing documents into the cellar safe, checking behind him like he expected someone to catch him. The timestamp didn't match the date he'd given police. He wasn't just defending himself, he was fabricating a version of events where I was the criminal. My hand tightened around the drive. Whatever line existed between us had vanished. The next morning, I walked into the Yountville bank with a file of authorization documents and a knot forming low in my stomach. After reviewing my credentials, a banker named Joshua led me to a private room and placed a stack of records in front of me. The numbers were staggering. Over 3 consecutive years, withdrawals from my parents' joint account traced a clean pattern. 1.9 million, then 2.3, then another 2 million funneled into Wine Preservation Storage LLC in Oregon, a business with no physical warehouses. It was a holding station for assets meant to disappear. Then Joshua slid another file toward me, Gray Falcon Trust. No owner, no listed beneficiary, no address. A structure used only when someone was preparing to abandon their identity entirely. But the email thread hit hardest. Notes from the Nevada network confirmed that the Oregon properties were ready and that, once the divorce was finalized, Mr. E could proceed north. There was nothing ambiguous about it, and buried in the loan documents, my mother's name appeared attached to a financial obligation she had never seen. If the wrong investigator traced the trail, she would be the one facing scrutiny. I gathered every page, printing copies until the machine whirred with heat. By the time I sealed the envelope, I knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. It wouldn't just expose him, it would stop him. The morning of the hearing felt heavier than any I'd lived through. I pulled on a navy suit, tied my hair back, and carried the envelope that had kept me awake the entire night. As the judge reviewed the forged transfer, the hidden funds, and the email about fleeing north, a disbelieving laugh escaped him. The entire courtroom shifted. He announced my father had lied under oath, voided the settlement, froze every asset, returned the stolen money to my mother, and referred the case for federal investigation. My father collapsed into his chair, and for the first time in my life, the room stood on my mother's side. As soon as the judge stepped out, the room cracked open. My father's attorney stammered that everything was lost, clutching papers like they might rearrange themselves and save him. Court officers surrounded my father, urging him to sit, but he struggled to stand, staring at me with a stunned disbelief that bordered on desperation. He asked how I had done this, as if the truth had ambushed him instead of living in his shadow all along. I didn't respond. My mother stood a few feet away, eyes red but no longer frightened. What flickered across her face wasn't victory, it was freedom, sharp and fragile, like something she hadn't dared imagine. Officers confiscated my father's phone and laptop. He protested, but no one stepped forward to defend him. Outside the doors, IRS and DOJ agents were arriving, drawing murmurs from strangers who suddenly realized this wasn't a simple family dispute. I took my mother's hand and walked her down the long hallway, the sunlight catching the glossy floor like a path newly cleared. She whispered she never wanted me to bear this weight. I told her I hadn't carried it for him, I'd carried it for her. Her hand settled into mine without trembling. By midday, his accounts were frozen, contracts withdrawn, travel restricted. The empire he built on control collapsed in hours. My mother stepped into the daylight lighter than I'd ever seen her, and for the first time, the story felt finished. A year passed, carrying with it a softness neither of us had expected. My mother settled into a small patch of land in the southern edge of Sonoma, a place where the soil stayed warm under the sun and the world felt far removed from the noise that once ruled her life. She didn't plant vines for profit or prestige. She planted because tending something that grew on its own terms helped her breathe again. Her workshop, Art and Vineyard Healing, opened quietly. On the first morning, 5 women arrived, each carrying a history they kept tucked behind careful smiles. My mother welcomed them with trays of lavender tea, the steam curling gently between rows of young vines. The air smelled of rain-soaked earth and possibility. I watched her move through the space with a steadiness I had never seen before, like she had finally stepped into a life that fit. My own days found a calmer rhythm. I moved back to Sacramento, took the promotion offered after the case closed, and let the quiet become something I no longer feared. One afternoon, while helping her string wire between 2 new posts, my phone buzzed. The message came from a number I didn't recognize, but the words were unmistakable. "Mara, it's your father. They're taking everything. You have to help me." I stared at the screen, waiting for anger or satisfaction or something familiar to rise. Nothing did, just a hollow stillness. I blocked the number. My mother called to me, holding a small cluster of new growth, proud as if she'd found treasure. I walked toward her, smiling without effort. There was no vengeance left, no fear, no shadow, just 2 women stepping into a season finally their own. My mother walked beside me with the fragile stillness of someone bracing for impact, not expecting protection. Inside the courtroom, my father entered with the swagger of a man convinced he had already won polished suit, measured smile, his attorney trailing in him like a shadow. His quick glance toward me carried a silent challenge, as if daring me to try. When the judge called the session to order, my father's attorney presented their financial disclosures with practiced confidence, claiming there were no hidden assets, no external accounts, no questionable transfers. My father lifted his hand to the Bible, swearing he had been fully transparent. My mother's hands trembled in her lap. I rose before I let myself reconsider. I told the court I had documents tied directly to his testimony. The room froze. My father snapped at me to sit, but the judge motioned me forward. I placed the envelope on the bench. 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 The envelope on the bench.